Chapter 19. Constantius sole Emperor. Part 1. Constantius sole Emperor, elevation and death of Gallus, danger and elevation of Julian, Sarmatian and Persian wars, victories of Julian. In Gaul, the divided provinces of the empire were again united by the victory of Constantius, but as that feeble prince was destitute of personal merit, either in peace or war, as he feared his generals and distrusted his ministers, the triumph of his arms served only to establish the reign of the eunuchs over the Roman world. Those unhappy beings, the ancient production of Oriental jealousy and despotism, 1. Were introduced into Greece and Rome by the contagion of Asiatic luxury. 2. Their progress was rapid, and the eunuchs who, in the time of Augustus, had been abhorred as the monstrous retinue of an Egyptian queen, 3. Were gradually admitted into the families of matrons, of senators, and of the emperors themselves. 4. Restrained by the severe edicts of Domitian and Nerva, cherished by the pride of Diocletian, reduced to an humble station by the prudence of Constantine. 6. They multiplied in the palaces of his degenerate sons, and insensibly acquired the knowledge, and at length the direction, of the secret counsels of Constantius. The aversion and contempt which mankind had so uniformly entertained for that imperfect species appears to have degraded their character, and to have rendered them almost as incapable as they were supposed to be, of conceiving any generous sentiment, or of performing any worthy action. 7. But the eunuchs were skilled in the arts of flattery and intrigue, and they alternately governed the mind of Constantius by his fears, his indolence, and his vanity. 8. Whilst he viewed in a deceitful mirror the fair appearance of public prosperity, he supinely permitted them to intercept the complaints of the injured provinces, to accumulate immense treasures by the sale of justice and of honors, to disgrace the most important dignities by the promotion of those who had purchased at their hands the powers of oppression. 9. And to gratify their resentment against the few independent spirits who arrogantly refused to solicit the protection of slaves. Of these slaves, the most distinguished was the chamberlain Eusebius, who ruled the monarch and the palace with such absolute sway that Constantius, according to the sarcasm of an impartial historian, possessed some credit with this haughty favorite. 10. By his artful suggestions, the emperor was persuaded to subscribe the condemnation of the unfortunate Gallus, and to add a new crime to the long list of unnatural murders which pollute the honor of the house of Constantine. 1. Return. Ammianus L14c. C. imputes the first practice of castration to the cruel ingenuity of Semiramis, who is supposed to have reigned above 1900 years before Christ. The use of eunuchs is of high antiquity, both in Asia and Egypt. They are mentioned in the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 33. 1. C. Goget, Origines des Lois, and C. Part E, Loi C3. 2. Return. Eunucham dixtivelle, tu cae solai utonter, his regine, Tehon. Eunuch. Act I, Scene 2. This play is translated from Meander, and the original must have appeared soon after the eastern conquests of Alexander to Thretron. Mini, Mile, Sipodonibus, Severvo Hugosis potest, Ola. By the word espador, the Romans very forcibly expressed their abhorrence of this mutilated condition. The Greek appellation of eunuchs, which insensibly prevailed, had a milder sound and a more ambiguous sense. Main, i.e., we need only mention Poseidus, a freedman and eunuch of Claudius, in whose favor the emperor prostituted some of the most honorable rewards of military valor. See Sueton. In Claudio c. 28, Poseidus employed a great part of his wealth in building. Ut spado vinspat, Capitolia nostra Poseidus. Juvenal, Sat. 14. 6. Return. There is a passage in the Augustan history, piece 137, in which Lampridius, whilst he praises Alexander Severus and Constantine for restraining the tyranny of the eunuchs, deplores the mischiefs which they occasioned in other reigns. Huc accedit quod eunuchos nec in consiliis nec in ministeriis habuit, qui soli principes perdunt, dum eos morientium aut regum, persarum volunt vivere, qui a populo etiam amicissimum se movent, qui intervenuntiae sunt, aliud quam respondetur, referentes, claudontis principem suum, et agentis ante omnia nequid siat. 7. Return the Xenophon Cyropaedia. L8. p. 5. He has stated the specious reasons which engaged Cyrus to entrust his person to the guard of eunuchs. He had observed in animals that although the practice of castration might tame their ungovernable fierceness, it did not diminish their strength or spirit. and he persuaded himself that those who were separated from the rest of humankind would be more firmly attached to the person of their benefactor. But a long experience has contradicted the judgment of Cyrus. Some particular instances may occur of eunuchs distinguished by their fidelity, their valor, and their abilities, but if we examine the general history of Persia, India, and China, we shall find that the power of the eunuchs has uniformly marked the decline and fall of every dynasty. 8. Return. C. Ammianus Marcellinus, L21. C. Estine, 16, L22. C4. The whole tenor of his impartial history serves to justify the invectives of Mamertinus, of Libanius, and of Julian himself, who have insulted the vices of the court of Constantius. 9. Return. Aurelius Victor censures the negligence of his sovereign in choosing the governors of the provinces and the generals of the army, and concludes his history with a very bold observation, as it is much more dangerous under a feeble reign to attack the ministers than the master himself. Ut verum absolvum brevi, ut imperatore ipso plarius, ita apparitorum plerisque magis atrox nihil. When the two nephews of Constantine, Gallus and Julian, were saved from the fury of the soldiers, the former was about 12 and the latter about 6 years of age, and, as the eldest was thought to be of a sickly constitution, they obtained with the less difficulty a precarious and dependent life from the affected pity of Constantius, who was sensible that the execution of these helpless orphans would have been esteemed by all mankind an act of the most deliberate cruelty. 11 different cities of Ionia and Bithynia were assigned for the places of their exile and education, but as soon as their growing years excited the jealousy of the emperor, he judged it more prudent to secure those unhappy youths in the strong castle of Macellum near Caesarea. The treatment which they experienced during a 6 years' confinement was partly such as they could hope from a careful guardian, and partly such as they might dread from a suspicious tyrant. 12. Their prison was an ancient palace, the residence of the kings of Cappadocia. The situation was pleasant, the buildings stately, the enclosure spacious. They pursued their studies and practiced their exercises under the tuition of the most skillful masters, and the numerous household appointed to attend, or rather to guard, the nephews of Constantine was not unworthy of the dignity of their birth. But they could not disguise to themselves that they were deprived of fortune, of freedom, and of safety, secluded from the society of all whom they could trust or esteem, and condemned to pass their melancholy hours in the company of slaves devoted to the commands of a tyrant who had already injured them beyond the hope of reconciliation. At length, however, the emergencies of the state compelled the emperor, or rather his eunuchs, to invest Gallus in the 25th year of his age with the title of Caesar, and to cement this political connection by his marriage with the princess Constantina. After a formal interview, in which the two princes mutually engaged their faith never to undertake anything to the prejudice of each other, they repaired without delay to their respective stations. Constantius continued his march towards the west, and Gallus fixed his residence at Antioch, from whence, with a delegated authority, he administered the 5 great dioceses of the eastern prefecture. 13. In this fortunate change, the new Caesar was not unmindful of his brother Julian, who obtained the honors of his rank, the appearances of liberty, and the restitution of an ample patrimony. 1411. Return. Gregory Nazianzen Orat. 3p90 reproaches the apostate with his ingratitude towards Mark, Bishop of Arethusa, who had contributed to save his life, and we learn, though from a less respectable authority, Tillemont, Hist. Des Empereurs, Tom. EVP 916, that Julian was concealed in the sanctuary of a church. Snote: Gallus and Julian were not sons of the same mother. Their father, Julius Constantius, had had Gallus by his first wife, named Galla. Julian was the son of Basilina, whom he had espoused in a second marriage. Tillemont, Hist. Des Emp. Vie de Constantin, Art. 3g12. Return. The most authentic account of the education and adventures of Julian is contained in the epistle or manifesto which he himself addressed to the Senate and people of Athens. Libanius, Orat. Parentilis on the side of the pagans, and Socrates, LN3C E1 on that of the Christians, have preserved several interesting circumstances. The 13 return Maeve, for the promotion of Gallus, see Edatius, Zosimus, and the 2 victors. According to Philostorgius, ELN bishop was the witness, C. Ophilus, an Arian bishop was the witness, and, as it were, the guarantee of this solemn engagement. He supported that character with generous firmness, but M. de Tillemont Hist. 1120, thinks it very improbable that a heretic should have possessed such virtue. 14 Return. Julian was at first permitted to pursue his studies at Constantinople, but the reputation which he acquired soon excited the jealousy of Constantius, and the young prince was advised to withdraw himself to the less conspicuous scenes of Bithynia and Ionia. The writers the most indulgent to the memory of Gallus, and even Julian himself, though he wished to cast a veil over the frailties of his brother, are obliged to confess that the Caesar was incapable of reigning. Transported from a prison to a throne, he possessed neither genius nor application nor docility to compensate for the want of knowledge and experience. A temper naturally morose and violent, instead of being corrected, was soured by solitude and adversity. The remembrance of what he had endured disposed him to retaliation rather than to sympathy, and the ungoverned sallies of his rage were often fatal to those who approached his person or were subject to his power. 15 Constantina, his wife, is described not as a woman, but as one of the infernal furies tormented with an insatiate thirst of human blood. 16. Instead of employing her influence to insinuate the mild counsels of prudence and humanity, she exasperated the fierce passions of her husband. And as she retained the vanity, though she had renounced, the gentleness of her sex, a pearl necklace was esteemed an equivalent price for the murder of an innocent and virtuous nobleman. 17. The cruelty of Gallus was sometimes displayed in the undissembled violence of popular or military executions, and was sometimes disguised by the abuse of law and the forms of judicial proceedings. The private houses of Antioch and the places of public resort were besieged by spies and informers, and the Caesar himself, concealed in a plebeian habit, very frequently condescended to assume that odious character. Every apartment of the palace was adorned with the instruments of death and torture, and a general consternation was diffused through the capital of Syria. The Prince of the East, as if he had been conscious how much he had to fear and how little he deserved to reign, selected for the objects of his resentment the provincials accused of some imaginary treason, and his own courtiers, whom with more reason he suspected of incensing by their secret correspondence the timid and suspicious mind of Constantius. But he forgot that he was depriving himself of his only support, the affection of the people, whilst he furnished the malice of his enemies with the arms of truth, and afforded the emperor the fairest pretense of exacting the forfeit of his purple and of his life. 1815 Return. C. Julian. Ad SPQ. AP2 S21. Jerome. In Cron. Aurelius. Victor. Eutropius. X. 14. I shall copy the words of Eutropius, who wrote his abridgment about 15 years after the death of Gallus, when there was no longer any motive either to flatter or to depreciate his character. Multis incivilibus gestis Gallus Caesar, via natura ferox et ad tyrannidem pronia, si suo jure imperare liquisset. Sistine Return. Megera quidem mortalis, inflammatrix saevientis assidua, humani cruoris avida, N.C. Amien, Marcellin, L14. C1. The sincerity of Ammianus would not suffer him to misrepresent facts or characters, but his love of ambitious ornaments frequently betrayed him into an unnatural vehemence of expression. To 17 Return. His name was Climatius of Alexandria, and his only crime was a refusal to gratify the desires of his love. Ammien 14. C. Ammianus D.L. 14 C. 1-7. A very ample detail of the cruelties of Gallus. His brother Julian, p. 272, insinuates that a secret conspiracy had been formed against him, and Zosimus names Leo II, p. 35. The persons engaged in it, a minister of considerable rank, and two obscure agents, who were resolved to make their fortune. As long as the civil war suspended the fate of the Roman world, Constantius dissembled his knowledge of the weak and cruel administration to which his choice had subjected the East, and the discovery of some assassins, secretly dispatched to Antioch by the tyrant of Gaul, was employed to convince the public that the emperor and the Caesar were united by the same interest and pursued by the same enemies. 19. But when the victory was decided in favor of Constantius, his dependent colleague became less useful and less formidable. Every circumstance of his conduct was severely and suspiciously examined, and it was privately resolved either to deprive Gallus of the purple, or at least to remove him from the indolent luxury of Asia to the hardships and dangers of a German war. The death of Theophilus, consular of the province of Syria, who in a time of scarcity had been massacred by the people of Antioch, with the connivance and almost at the instigation of Gallus, was justly resented, not only as an act of wanton cruelty, but as a dangerous insult on the supreme majesty of Constantius. Two ministers of illustrious rank, Domitian the Oriental Prefect and Montius, Quaestor of the Palace, were empowered by a special commission, 1911, to visit and reform the state of the East. They were instructed to behave towards Gallus with moderation and respect, and, by the gentlest arts of persuasion, to engage him to comply with the invitation of his brother and colleague. The rashness of the prefect disappointed these prudent measures and hastened his own ruin, as well as that of his enemy. On his arrival at Antioch, Domitian passed disdainfully before the gates of the palace, and alleging a slight pretense of indisposition, continued several days in sullen retirement to prepare an inflammatory memorial, which he transmitted to the imperial court. Yielding at length to the pressing solicitations of Gallus, the prefect condescended to take his seat in council. But his first step was to signify a concise and haughty mandate, importing that the Caesar should immediately repair to Italy, and threatening that he himself would punish his delay or hesitation by suspending the usual allowance of his household. The nephew and daughter of Constantine, who could ill brook the insolence of a subject, expressed their resentment by instantly delivering Domitian to the custody of a guard. The quarrel still admitted of some terms of accommodation. They were rendered impracticable by the imprudent behavior of Montius, a statesman whose arts and experience were frequently betrayed by the levity of his disposition. 20. The quaestor reproached Gallus in a haughty language that a prince who was scarcely authorized to remove a municipal magistrate should presume to imprison a praetorian prefect, convoked a meeting of the civil and military officers, and required them, in the name of their sovereign, to defend the person and dignity of his representatives. By this rash declaration of war, the impatient temper of Gallus was provoked to embrace the most desperate counsels. He ordered his guards to stand to their arms, assembled the populace of Antioch, and recommended to their zeal the care of his safety and revenge. His commands were too fatally obeyed. They rudely seized the prefect and the quaestor, and tying their legs together with ropes, they dragged them through the streets of the city, inflicted 1,000 insults and 1,000 wounds on these unhappy victims, and at last precipitated their mangled and lifeless bodies into the stream of the Orontes. 21. 19 Return. Zonaras, L13. Tom. 2. P. 17, 18. The assassins had seduced a great number of legionaries, but their designs were discovered and revealed by an old woman in whose cottage they lodged. 1911. Return. The commission seems to have been granted to Domitian alone. Montius interfered to support his authority. Ame. Mark. Loco cite. May I return, in the present text of Ammianus we read, Asper, quidem, sedecteri. With the aid of an old manuscript, Valesius has rectified the first of these corruptions, and we perceive a ray of light in the substitution of the word vapor. If we venture to change lenitatum into levitatum, this alteration of a single letter will render the whole passage clear and consistent. 21. Return. Instead of being obliged to collect scattered and imperfect hints from various sources, we now enter into the full stream of the history of Ammianus, and need only refer to the 7th and 9th chapters of his 14th book. Philostorgius, however, LL3c 28, though partial to Gallus, should not be entirely overlooked. Der Urschel dop partial to Gallus should not be entirely overlooked or dobalus. It was only in a field of battle that he could assert his innocence with any hope of success. But the mind of that prince was violence and weakness. Instead of assuming the title of Augustus, instead of employing in his defense the troops and treasures of the East, he suffered himself to be deceived by the affected tranquility of Constantius, who, leaving him the vain pageantry of a court, imperceptibly recalled the veteran legions from the provinces of Asia. But as it still appeared dangerous to arrest Gallus in his capital, the slow and safer arts of dissimulation were practiced with success. The frequent and pressing epistles of Constantius were filled with professions of confidence and friendship, exhorting the Caesar to discharge the duties of his high station, to relieve his colleague from a part of the public cares, and to assist the West by his presence, his counsels, and his arms. After so many reciprocal injuries, Gallus had reason to fear and to distrust. But he had neglected the opportunities of flight and of resistance. He was seduced by the flattering assurances of the tribune, Scudilo, who, under the semblance of a rough soldier, disguised the most artful insinuation, and he depended on the credit of his wife Constantina, till the unseasonable death of that princess completed the ruin in which he had been involved by her impetuous passions. 2220. Returned. She had preceded her husband, but died of a fever on the road at a little place in Bithynia, called Coenum Gallicanum. Chapter 19. Constantius Sole Emperor. Part 2. After a long delay, the reluctant Caesar set forwards on his journey to the imperial court. From Antioch to Hadrianople he traversed the wide extent of his dominions with a numerous and stately train, and as he labored to conceal his apprehensions from the world, and perhaps from himself, he entertained the people of Constantinople with an exhibition of the games of the circus. The progress of the journey might, however, have warned him of the impending danger. In all the principal cities he was met by ministers of confidence, commissioned to seize the offices of government, to observe his motions, and to prevent the hasty sallies of his despair. The persons dispatched to secure the provinces which he left behind passed him with cold salutations or affected disdain, and the troops, whose station lay along the public road, were studiously removed on his approach, lest they might be tempted to offer their swords for the service of a civil war. 23. After Gallus had been permitted to repose himself a few days at Hadrianople, he received a mandate, expressed in the most haughty and absolute style, that his splendid retinue should halt in that city, while the Caesar himself, with only 10 post-carriages, should hasten to the imperial residence at Milan. In this rapid journey, the profound respect which was due to the brother and colleague of Constantius was insensibly changed into rude familiarity, and Gallus, who discovered in the countenances of the attendants that they already considered themselves as his guards, and might soon be employed as his executioners, began to accuse his fatal rashness, and to recollect with terror and remorse the conduct by which he had provoked his fate. The dissimulation which had hitherto been preserved was laid aside at Pitovio 2011 in Pannonia. He was conducted to a palace in the suburbs, where the general Barbatio, with a select band of soldiers who could neither be moved by pity nor corrupted by rewards, expected the arrival of his illustrious victim. In the close of the evening he was arrested, ignominiously stripped of the ensigns of Caesar, and hurried away to Pola, 23b in Istria, a sequestered prison which had been so recently polluted with royal blood. The horror which he felt was soon increased by the appearance of his implacable enemy, the eunuch Eusebius, who, with the assistance of a notary and a tribune, proceeded to interrogate him concerning the administration of the East. The Caesar sank under the weight of shame and guilt, confessed all the criminal actions and all the treasonable designs with which he was charged, and by imputing them to the advice of his wife, exasperated the indignation of Constantius, who reviewed with partial prejudice the minutes of the examination. The emperor was easily convinced that his own safety was incompatible with the life of his cousin. The sentence of death was signed, dispatched, and executed, and the nephew of Constantine, with his hands tied behind his back, was beheaded in prison like the vilest malefactor. 24. Those who are inclined to palliate the cruelties of Constantius assert that he soon relented and endeavored to recall the bloody mandate, but that the second messenger, entrusted with the reprieve, was detained by the eunuchs who dreaded the unforgiving temper of Gallus and were desirous of reuniting to their empire the wealthy provinces of the East. 25-23 return. The Theban legions, which were then quartered at Hadrianople, sent a deputation to Gallus with a tender of their services. Amiens. L14c. 11. The Notitia. S. 6, 2038, edit. Lab. mentions 3 several legions which bore the name of Theban. The zeal of M. de Voltaire to destroy a despicable though celebrated legion has tempted him on the slightest grounds to deny the existence of a Theban legion in the Roman armies. See Ouvre de Voltaire, tom. 414, quarto edition. D.C. The complete narrative of the journey and death of Gallus and Ammianus, L. 114c. 114, c. 11. Julian complains that his brother was put to death without a trial, attempts to justify, or at least to excuse, the cruel revenge which he had inflicted on his enemies, but seems at last to acknowledge that he might justly have been deprived of the purple. 25 return. Pilostorgius, LIVC, 1 VC 1, Sonaras, L 13, 2, p. 19. But the former was partial towards an Arian monarch, and the latter transcribed, without choice or criticism, whatever he found in the writings of the ancients. Besides the reigning emperor, Julian alone survived, of all the numerous posterity of Constantius Chlorus. The misfortune of his royal birth involved him in the disgrace of Gallus. From his retirement in the happy country of Ionia, he was conveyed under a strong guard to the court of Milan, where he languished above 7 months, in the continual apprehension of suffering the same ignominious death, which was daily inflicted almost before his eyes on the friends and adherents of his persecuted family. His looks, his gestures, his silence were scrutinized with malignant curiosity, and he was perpetually assaulted by enemies whom he had never offended, and by arts to which he was a stranger. 26. But in the school of adversity, Julian insensibly acquired the virtues of firmness and discretion. He defended his honor as well as his life against the ensnaring subtleties of the eunuchs, who endeavored to extort some declaration of his sentiments, and whilst he cautiously suppressed his grief and resentment, he nobly disdained to flatter the tyrant by any seeming approbation of his brother's murder. Julian most devoutly ascribes his miraculous deliverance to the protection of the gods, who had exempted his innocence from the sentence of destruction pronounced by their justice against the impious house of Constantine. 27. As the most effectual instrument of their providence, he gratefully acknowledges the steady and generous friendship of the Empress Eusebia, 28, a woman of beauty and merit, who, by the ascendant which she had gained over the mind of her husband, counterbalanced, in some measure, the powerful conspiracy of the eunuchs. By the intercession of his patroness, Julian was admitted into the imperial presence. He pleaded his cause with a decent freedom, he was heard with favor, and, notwithstanding the efforts of his enemies, who urged the danger of sparing an avenger of the blood of Gallus, the milder sentiment of Eusebia prevailed in the council. But the effects of a second interview were dreaded by the eunuchs, and Julian was advised to withdraw for a while into the neighborhood of Milan, till the emperor thought proper to assign the city of Athens for the place of his honorable exile. As he had discovered from his earliest youth a propensity, or rather passion, for the language, the manners, the learning, and the religion of the Greeks, he obeyed with pleasure an order so agreeable to his wishes. Far from the tumult of arms and the treachery of courts, he spent 6 months under the groves of the Academy, in a free intercourse with the philosophers of the age, who studied to cultivate the genius, to encourage the vanity, and to inflame the devotion of their royal pupil. Their labors were not unsuccessful, and Julian inviolably preserved for Athens that tender regard which seldom fails to arise in a liberal mind, from the recollection of the place where it has discovered and exercised its growing powers. The gentleness and affability of manners which his temper suggested and his situation imposed insensibly engaged the affections of the strangers as well as citizens with whom he conversed. Some of his fellow students might perhaps examine his behavior with an eye of prejudice and aversion, but Julian established in the schools of Athens a general prepossession in favor of his virtues and talents, which was soon diffused over the Roman world. 29-26, return, see Ammianus Marcellin, L. 15. C. 138. Julian himself, in his epistle to the Athenians, draws a very lively and just picture of his own danger and of his sentiments. He shows, however, a tendency to exaggerate his sufferings by insinuating, though in obscure terms, that they lasted above a year, a period which cannot be reconciled with the truth of chronology. 27. Return. Julian has worked the crimes and misfortunes of the family of Constantine into an allegorical fable, which is happily conceived and agreeably related. It forms the conclusion of the seventh oration, from whence it has been detached and translated by the Abbé de la Bletterie, V. de Jovian, Tom. 2p. 385-208. 28 Return. She was a native of Thessalonica, in Macedonia, of a noble family, and the daughter, as well as sister, of consuls. Her marriage with the emperor may be placed in the year 352. In a divided age, the historians of all parties agree in her praises. See their testimonies collected by Tillemont, Hist. des Empereurs, Tom. EVP 750. 29 Return. De Libanius and Gregory Nazianzen have exhausted the arts as well as the powers of their eloquence to represent Julian as the first of heroes or the worst of tyrants. Gregory was his fellow student at Athens, and the symptoms which he so tragically describes of the future wickedness of the Sichan manner. He protests, however, that he then foresaw and foretold the calamities of the church and state. Greg. Nazianzen. Orat. EVP 121, 12-2. Whilst his hours were passed in studious retirement, the empress, resolute to achieve the generous design which she had undertaken, was not unmindful of the care of his fortune. The death of the late Caesar had left Constantius invested with the sole command and oppressed by the accumulated weight of a mighty empire. Before the wounds of civil discord could be healed, the provinces of Gaul were overwhelmed by a deluge of barbarians. The Sarmatians no longer respected the barrier of the Danube. The impunity of rapine had increased the boldness and numbers of the wild Isaurians. Those robbers descended from their craggy mountains to ravage the adjacent country, and had even presumed, though without success, to besiege the important city of Seleucia, which was defended by a garrison of 3 Roman legions. Above all, the Persian monarch, elated by victory, again threatened the peace of Asia, and the presence of the emperor was indispensably required, both in the west and in the east. For the first time, Constantius sincerely acknowledged that his single strength was unequal to such an extent of care and of dominion. 30 Insensible to the voice of flattery, which assured him that his all-powerful virtue and celestial fortune would still continue to triumph over every obstacle, he listened with complacency to the advice of Eusebia, which gratified his indolence without offending his suspicious pride. As she perceived that the remembrance of Gallus dwelt on the emperor's mind, she artfully turned his attention to the opposite characters of the 2 brothers, which from their infancy had been compared to those of Domitian and of Titus. 31. She accustomed her husband to consider Julian as a youth of a mild, unambitious disposition, whose allegiance and gratitude might be secured by the gift of the purple, and who was qualified to fill with honor a subordinate station, without aspiring to dispute the commands or to shade the glories of his sovereign and benefactor. After an obstinate though secret struggle, the opposition of the favorite eunuch submitted to the ascendancy of the empress, and it was resolved that Julian, after celebrating his nuptials with Helena, sister of Constantius, should be appointed with the title of Caesar to reign over the countries beyond the Alps. 32:30. Return. Succumber tot necessitadibus tomque crebri unum se, quod nunquam fecerat aperte demonstrans, Amiens. L15c. 8. He then expresses in their own words the flattering assurances of the courtiers. The 31 Return. Tantum tempratis moribus Juliani, diffrantis moribus Juliani, diffianda biuri Siciani filios fuit, Domitianum et Titum. Amiens. L14g. Vivon. The circumstances and education of the 2 brothers were so nearly the same as to afford a strong example of the innate difference of characters. Although the order which recalled him to court was probably accompanied by some intimation of his approaching greatness, he appeals to the people of Athens to witness his tears of undissembled sorrow when he was reluctantly torn away from his beloved retirement. 33. He trembled for his life, for his fame, and even for his virtue, and his sole confidence was derived from the persuasion that Minerva inspired all his actions, and that he was protected by an invisible guard of angels, whom for that purpose she had borrowed from the sun and moon. He approached with horror the palace of Milan, nor could the ingenuous youth conceal his indignation when he found himself accosted with false and servile respect by the assassins of his family. Eusebia, rejoicing in the success of her benevolent schemes, embraced him with the tenderness of a sister and endeavored, by the most soothing caresses, to dispel his terrors and reconcile him to his fortune. But the ceremony of shaving his beard and his awkward demeanor when he first exchanged the cloak of a Greek philosopher for the military habit of a Roman prince amused during a few days the levity of the imperial court. 34-33, returned Julian. Ad SPQ. AP 275-276, Libanius, or at XP 276 Stout. Julian did not yield till the gods had signified their will by repeated visions and omens. His piety then forbade him to resist. 34. Returned Julian himself relates, pp. 274, with some humor, the circumstances of his own metamorphoses, his downcast looks, and his perplexity at being thus suddenly transported into a new world, where every object appeared strange and hostile. The emperors of the age of Constantine no longer deigned to consult with the Senate in the choice of a colleague, but they were anxious that their nomination should be ratified by the consent of the army. On this solemn occasion the guards, with the other troops whose stations were in the neighborhood of Milan, appeared under arms, and Constantius ascended his lofty tribunal, holding by the hand his cousin Julian, who entered the same day into the 25th year of his age. 35. In a studied speech, conceived and delivered with dignity, the emperor represented the various dangers which threatened the prosperity of the republic, the necessity of naming a Caesar for the administration of the West, and his own intention, if it was agreeable to their wishes, of rewarding with the honors of the purple the promising virtues of the nephew of Constantine. The approbation of the soldiers was testified by a respectful murmur. They gazed on the manly countenance of Julian, and observed with pleasure that the fire which sparkled in his eyes was tempered by a modest blush on being thus exposed for the first time to the public view of mankind. As soon as the ceremony of his investiture had been performed, Constantius addressed him with the tone of authority which his superior age and station permitted him to assume, and exhorting the new Caesar to deserve by heroic deeds that sacred and immortal name, the emperor gave his colleague the strongest assurances of a friendship which should never be impaired by time, nor interrupted by their separation into the most distant climes. As soon as the speech was ended, the troops, as a token of applause, clashed their shields against their knees. 36. While the officers who surrounded the tribunal expressed, with decent reserve, their sense of the merits of the representative of Constantius. 36. In return, militares omnes orendo fragore scuta genibus illidentes, quodes prosperitatis indicium plenum, nam contra commentum estet dolores, id documentum estet doloris. Ammianus adds, with a nice distinction, Iumque ut potiori reverentia severatur, nec supra modum laudabon, nec infraquam decebat. The two princes returned to the palace in the same chariot, and during the slow procession Julian repeated to himself a verse of his favorite Homer, which he might equally apply to his fortune and to his fears. 37. The 24 days which the Caesar spent at Milan after his investiture, and the first months of his Gallic reign were devoted to a splendid but severe captivity, nor could the acquisition of honor compensate for the loss of freedom. 38. His steps were watched, his correspondence was intercepted, and he was obliged by prudence to decline the visits of his most intimate friends. Of his former domestics, 4 only were permitted to attend him, 2 pages, his physician, and his librarian, the last of whom was employed in the care of a valuable collection of books, the gift of the empress, who studied the inclinations as well as the interest of her friend. In the room of these faithful servants a household was formed, such indeed as became the dignity of a Caesar, but it was filled with a crowd of slaves, destitute and perhaps incapable of any attachment for their new master, to whom for the most part they were either unknown or suspected. His want of experience might require the assistance of a wise counsel, but the minute instructions which regulated the service of his table and the distribution of his hours were adapted to a youth still under the discipline of his preceptors, rather than to the situation of a prince entrusted with the conduct of an important war. If he aspired to deserve the esteem of his subjects, he was checked by the fear of displeasing his sovereign, and even the fruits of his marriage bed were blasted by the jealous artifices of Eusebia 39 herself, who, on this occasion alone, seems to have been unmindful of the tenderness of her sex and the generosity of her character. The memory of his father and of his brothers reminded Julian of his own danger, and his apprehensions were increased by the recent and unworthy fate of Silvanus. In the summer which preceded his own elevation, that general had been chosen to deliver Gaul from the tyranny of the barbarians, but Silvanus soon discovered that he had left his most dangerous enemies in the imperial court. A dexterous informer, countenanced by several of the principal ministers, procured from him some recommendatory letters, and erasing the whole of the contents, except the signature, filled up the vacant parchment with matters of high and treasonable import. By the industry and courage of his friends, the fraud was, however, detected, and in a great council of the civil and military officers, held in the presence of the emperor himself, the innocence of Silvanus was publicly acknowledged. But the discovery came too late. The report of the calumny and the hasty seizure of his estate had already provoked the indignant chief to the rebellion of which he was so unjustly accused. He assumed the purple at his head, quarters of Cologne, and his active powers appeared to menace Italy with an invasion and Milan with a siege. In this emergency, Ursicinus, a general of equal rank, regained, by an act of treachery, the favor which he had lost by his eminent services in the East. Exasperated, as he might speciously allege, by the injuries of a similar nature, he hastened with a few followers to join the standard and to betray the confidence of his too credulous friend. After a reign of only 28 days, Silvanus was assassinated. The soldiers who, without any criminal intention, had blindly followed the example of their leader, immediately returned to their allegiance, and the flatterers of Constantius celebrated the wisdom and felicity of the monarch who had extinguished a civil war without the hazard of a battle. 4037 Return. The word purple, which Homer had used as a vague but common epithet for death, was applied by Julian to express, very aptly, the nature and object of his own apprehensions. 38 represents, in the most pathetic terms, p. 2077, the distress of his new situation. The provision for his table was, however, so elegant and sumptuous that the young philosopher rejected it with disdain. Cum legeret libellum assidu, quem Constantius, ut privinum ad studia mittens manius sua conscripserat, prelicenta disponens quid in convivio, Caesaris impendi deberit, Phasianum, et vulvam et sumen exigivetuit inferi. Amian, Marcellin, L. 16c, 5-39 Return. If we recollect that Constantine, the father of Helena, died above 18 years before, in a mature old age, she was soon afterwards delivered of a son who died immediately, quod obstetrix corrupta mercede, mox natum prasecto prusquam convenerat umbilico necavit. She accompanied the emperor and empress in their journey to Rome, and the latter quasitum venenum bibere per fraudem ilexit, ut quotiescumque concevisset, immaturum abgisserit partum. Amiens. L. 16, c. 10. Our physicians will determine whether there exists such a poison. For my own part, I am inclined to hope that the public malignity imputed the effects of accident as the guilt of Eusebia. 40. To return. Ammianus XV. 5. Was perfectly well informed of the conduct and fate of Silvanus. He himself was one of the few followers who attended Ursicinus in his dangerous enterprise. The protection of the Rhaetian frontier and the persecution of the Catholic Church detained Constantius in Italy above 18 months after the departure of Julian. Before the emperor returned into the East, he indulged his pride and curiosity in a visit to the ancient capital. 41. He proceeded from Milan to Rome along the Emilian and Flaminian ways, and as soon as he approached within 40 miles of the city, the march of a prince who had never vanquished a foreign enemy assumed the appearance of a triumphal procession. His splendid train was composed of all the ministers of luxury, but in a time of profound peace he was encompassed by the glittering arms of the numerous squadrons of his guards and cuirassiers. Their streaming banners of silk embossed with gold and shaped in the form of dragons waved round the person of the emperor. Constantius sat alone in a lofty car, resplendent with gold and precious gems, and, except when he bowed his head to pass under the gates of the cities, he affected a stately demeanor of inflexible, and, as it might seem, of insensible gravity. The severe discipline of the Persian youth had been introduced by the eunuchs into the imperial palace, and such were the habits of patience which they had inculcated, that during a slow and sultry march he was never seen to move his hand towards his face, or to turn his eyes either to the right or to the left. He was received by the magistrates and senate of Rome, and the emperor surveyed with attention the civil honors of the republic and the consular images of the noble families. The streets were lined with an innumerable multitude. Their repeated acclamations expressed their joy at beholding, after an absence of 32 years, the sacred person of their sovereign, and Constantius himself expressed with some pleasantry he affected surprise that the human race should thus suddenly be collected on the same spot. The son of Constantine was lodged in the ancient palace of Augustus. He presided in the Senate, harangued the people from the tribunal which Cicero had so often ascended, assisted with unusual courtesy at the games of the circus, and accepted the crowns of gold, as well as the panegyrics which had been prepared for the ceremony by the deputies of the principal cities. His short visit of 30 days was employed in viewing the monuments of art and power which were scattered over the 7 hills and the interjacent valleys. He admired the awful majesty of the Capitol, the vast extent of the baths of Caracalla and Diocletian, the severe simplicity of the Pantheon, the massy greatness of the amphitheatre of Titus, the elegant architecture of the theatre of Pompey and the Temple of Peace, and, above all, the stately structure of the Forum and Column of Trajan, acknowledging that the voice of fame, so prone to invent and to magnify, had made an inadequate report of the metropolis of the world. The traveler who has contemplated the ruins of ancient Rome may conceive some imperfect idea of the sentiments which they must have inspired when they reared their heads in the splendor of unsullied beauty. See the Pantheon, the severe simplicity of the Pantheon. 41. Return. For the particulars of the visit of Constantius to Rome, see Ammianus, L16. C10. We have only to add that Themistius was appointed deputy from Constantinople, and that he composed his 4th oration for his ceremony. The satisfaction which Constantius had received from this journey excited him to the generous emulation of bestowing on the Romans some memorial of his own gratitude and munificence. His first idea was to imitate the equestrian and colossal statue which he had seen in the Forum of Trajan, but when he had maturely weighed the difficulties of the execution, 42, he chose rather to embellish the capital by the gift of an Egyptian obelisk. In a remote but polished age, which seems to have preceded the invention of alphabetical writing, a great number of these obelisks had been erected, in the cities of Thebes and Heliopolis, by the ancient sovereigns of Egypt, in a just confidence that the simplicity of their form and the hardness of their substance would resist the injuries of time and violence. 43. Several of these extraordinary columns had been transported to Rome by Augustus and his successors as the most durable monuments of their power and victory. 44. But there remained one obelisk, which from its size or sanctity escaped for a long time the rapacious vanity of the conquerors. It was designed by Constantine to adorn his new city, 45, and, after being removed by his order from the pedestal where it stood before the Temple of the Sun at Heliopolis, was floated down the Nile to Alexandria. The death of Constantine suspended the execution of his purpose, and this obelisk was destined by his son to the ancient capital of the empire. A vessel of uncommon strength and capaciousness was provided to convey this enormous weight of granite, at least 115 feet in length, from the banks of the Nile to those of the Tiber. The obelisk of Constantius was landed about 3 miles from the city and elevated by the efforts of art and labor in the great circus of Rome. 46 461 Evan 42 Return, have to do reti. A fugitive prince of Persia observed to the emperor that if he made such a horse, he must think of preparing a similar stable, the Forum of Trajan. Another saying of Hormisdas is recorded, that one thing only had displeased him, to find that men died at Rome as well as elsewhere. If we adopt this reading of the text of Ammianus, displicuisse, instead of placuisse, we may consider it as a reproof of Roman vanity. The contrary sense would be that of a misanthrope. 43. Return. When Germanicus visited the ancient monuments of Thebes, the eldest of the priests explained to him the meaning of these hieroglyphics. Tacit. Annal. 2. c. 60. But it seems probable that before the useful invention of an alphabet, these natural or arbitrary signs were the common characters of Moses. Volume 3, P.E. Breddon, 69243, 45 Return, Amiens, Marcellin L. 17, c. 4. He gives us a Greek interpretation of the hieroglyphics, and his commentator Lyndon Brogius adds a Latin inscription, which, in 20 verses of the age of Constantius, contain a short history of the obelisk. 46 Return, Isidonat, Roma, Antiqua, L3, C214, L. Evis C12, and the learned, though confused, dissertation of Bargaeus on obelisks, inserted in the 4th volume of Gravius's Roman Antiquities, p. 1897, 1936. This dissertation is dedicated to Pope Sixtus V, who erected the obelisk of Constantius in the square before the Patriarchal Church of At. John Lateran, to 46-1 Ret. It is doubtful whether the obelisk transported by Constantius to Rome now exists. Even from the text of Ammianus, it is uncertain whether the interpretation of Hermapion refers to the older obelisk, obelisco incisus est veteriquem videmus in circo, raised, as he himself states, in the Circus Maximus long before by Augustus, or to the one brought by Constantius. The obelisk in the square before the church of St. John Lateran is ascribed not to Ramesses the Great, but to Thutmose II. Champollion 1 Lettre A.M. de Blacas, p. 32. The departure of Constantius from Rome was hastened by the alarming intelligence of the distress and danger of the Illyrian provinces. The distractions of civil war and the irreparable loss which the Roman legions had sustained in the Battle of Mursa exposed those countries, almost without defense, to the light cavalry of the barbarians, and particularly to the inroads of the Quadi, a fierce and powerful nation, who seemed to have exchanged the institutions of Germany for the arms and military arts of their Sarmatian allies. 47. The garrisons of the frontiers were insufficient to check their progress, and the indolent monarch was at length compelled to assemble, from the extremities of his dominions, the flower of the Palatine troops, to take the field in person, and to employ a whole campaign with the preceding autumn and the ensuing spring in the serious prosecution of the war. The emperor passed the Danube on a bridge of boats, cut in pieces all that encountered his march, penetrated into the heart of the country of the Quadi, and severely retaliated the calamities which they had inflicted on the Roman province. The dismayed barbarians were soon reduced to sue for peace. They offered the restitution of his captive subjects as an atonement for the past, and the noblest hostages as a pledge of their future conduct. The generous courtesy which was shown to the first among their chieftains who implored the clemency of Constantius encouraged the more timid or the more obstinate to imitate their example, and the imperial camp was crowded with the princes and ambassadors of the most distant tribes, who occupied the plains of the Lesser Poland and who might have deemed themselves secure behind the lofty ridge of the Carpathian Mountains. While Constantius gave laws to the barbarians beyond the Danube, he distinguished with specious compassion the Sarmatian exiles, who had been expelled from their native country by the rebellion of their slaves, and who formed a very considerable accession to the power of the Quadi. The emperor, embracing a generous but artful system of policy, released the Sarmatians from the bands of this humiliating dependence, and restored them, by a separate treaty, to the dignity of a nation united under the government of a king, the friend and ally of the Republic. He declared his resolution of asserting the justice of their cause, and of securing the peace of the provinces by the extirpation, or at least the banishment, of the Limigantes, whose manners were still infected with the vices of their servile origin. The execution of this design was attended with more difficulty than glory. The territory of the Limigantes was protected against the Romans by the Danube, against the hostile barbarians by the Teyss. The marshy lands which lay between those rivers, and were often covered by their inundations, formed an intricate wilderness, pervious only to the inhabitants, who were acquainted with its secret paths and inaccessible fortresses. On the approach of Constantius, the Limigantes tried the efficacy of prayers, of fraud, and of arms, but he sternly rejected their supplications, defeated their rude stratagems, and repelled with skill and firmness the efforts of their irregular valor. One of their most warlike tribes, established in a small island towards the conflux of the Teyss and the Danube, consented to pass the river with the intention of surprising the emperor during the security of an amicable conference. They soon became the victims of the perfidy which they meditated. Encompassed on every side, trampled down by the cavalry, slaughtered by the swords of the legions, they disdained to ask for mercy, and with an undaunted countenance still grasped their weapons in the agonies of death. After this victory, a considerable body of Romans was landed on the opposite banks of the Danube. The Taiphili, a Gothic tribe engaged in the service of the empire, invaded the Limigantes on the side of the Thais, and their former masters, the free Sarmatians, animated by hope and revenge, penetrated through the hilly country into the heart of their ancient possessions. A general conflagration revealed the huts of the barbarians, which were seated in the depth of the wilderness, and the soldier fought with confidence on marshy ground, which it was dangerous for him to tread. In this extremity, the bravest of the Limigantes were resolved to die in arms rather than to yield, but the milder sentiment, enforced by the authority of their elders, at length prevailed, and the suppliant crowd, followed by their wives and children, repaired to the imperial camp to learn their fate from the mouth of the conqueror. After celebrating his own clemency, which was still inclined to pardon their repeated crimes, and to spare the remnant of a guilty nation, Constantius assigned for the place of their exile a remote country, where they might enjoy a safe and honorable repose. The Limigantes obeyed with reluctance, but before they could reach, at least before they could occupy, their destined habitations, they returned to the banks of the Danube, exaggerating the hardships of their situation and requesting, with fervent professions of fidelity, that the emperor would grant them an undisturbed settlement within the limits of the Roman provinces. Instead of consulting his own experience of their incurable perfidy, Constantius listened to his flatterers, who were ready to represent the honor and advantage of accepting a colony of soldiers, at a time when it was much easier to obtain the pecuniary contributions than the military service of the subjects of the empire. The Limigantes were permitted to pass the Danube, and the emperor gave audience to the multitude in a large plain near the modern city of Buda. They surrounded the tribunal and seemed to hear with respect an oration full of mildness and dignity when one of the barbarians, casting his shoe into the air, exclaimed with a loud voice, "Marha! Marha! 4711," a word of defiance which was received as a signal of the tumult. They rushed with fury to seize the person of the emperor. His royal throne and golden couch were pillaged by these rude hands, but the faithful defense of his guards, who died at his feet, allowed him a moment to mount a fleet horse and to escape from the confusion. The disgrace which had been incurred by a treacherous surprise was soon retrieved by the numbers and discipline of the Romans, and the combat was only terminated by the extinction of the name and nation of the Limigantes. The free Sarmatians were reinstated in the possession of their ancient seats, and although Constantius distrusted the levity of their character, he entertained some hopes that a sense of gratitude might influence their future conduct. He had remarked the lofty stature and obsequious demeanor of Zizais, one of the noblest of their chiefs. He conferred on him the title of king, and Zizais proved that he was not unworthy to reign by a sincere and lasting attachment to the interests of his benefactor, who, after this splendid success, received the name of Sarmaticus from the acclamations of his victorious army. 48-47 Return. The events of this Quadian and Sarmatian war are related by Ammianus. 16, 10, 17, 12, 13 Return. Genti Sarmatarum. Magno decori confidens, apud eos regem dedit. Aurelius Victor. In a pompous oration pronounced by Constantius himself, he expatiates on his own exploits with much vanity and some truth. Chapter 19. Constantius Sole, Emperor. Part 3. While the Roman emperor and the Persian monarch, at the distance of 3,000 miles, defended their extreme limits against the barbarians of the Danube and of the Oxus, their intermediate frontier experienced the vicissitudes of a languid war and a precarious truce. Two of the eastern ministers of Constantius, the Praetorian prefect Musonian, whose abilities were disgraced by the want of truth and integrity, and Cassian, Duke of Mesopotamia, a hardy and veteran soldier, opened a secret negotiation with the satrap Tamsapor. 49-14-11-11. These overtures of peace, translated into the servile and flattering language of Asia, were transmitted to the camp of the great king, who resolved to signify by an ambassador the terms which he was inclined to grant to the suppliant Romans. Narses, whom he invested with that character, was honorably received in his passage through Antioch and Constantinople. He reached Sirmium after a long journey and, at his first audience, respectfully unfolded the silken veil which covered the haughty epistle of his sovereign. Sapor, King of Kings and Brother of the Sun and Moon, such were the lofty titles affected by Oriental vanity, expressed his satisfaction that his brother, Constantius Caesar, had been taught wisdom by adversity. As the lawful successor of Darius Hystaspes, Sapor asserted that the river Strymon in Macedonia was the true and ancient boundary of his empire, declaring, however, that as an evidence of his moderation, he would content himself with the provinces of Armenia and Mesopotamia, which had been fraudulently extorted from his ancestors. He alleged that, without the restitution of these disputed countries, it was impossible to establish any treaty on a solid and permanent basis. And he arrogantly threatened that if his ambassador returned in vain, he was prepared to take the field in the spring, and to support the justice of his cause by the strength of his invincible arms. Narses, who was endowed with the most polite and amiable manners, endeavored, as far as was consistent with his duty, to soften the harshness of the message. 50. Both the style and substance were maturely weighed in the imperial council, and he was dismissed with the following answer. Constantius had a right to disclaim the officiousness of his ministers, who had acted without any specific orders from the throne. He was not, however, averse to an equal and honorable treaty, but it was highly indecent, as well as absurd, to propose to the sole and victorious emperor of the Roman world the same conditions of peace which he had indignantly rejected at the time when his power was contracted within the narrow limits of the East. The chance of arms was uncertain, and Sapor should recollect that if the Romans had sometimes been vanquished in battle, they had almost always been successful in the event of the war. A few days after the departure of Narses, 3 ambassadors were sent to the court of Sapor, who was already returned from the Scythian expedition to his ordinary residence of Ctesiphon. A count, a notary, and a sophist had been selected for this important commission, and Constantius, who was secretly anxious for the conclusion of the peace, entertained some hopes that the dignity of the first of these ministers, the dexterity of the second, and the rhetoric of the third, 51, would persuade the Persian monarch to abate of the rigor of his demands. But the progress of their negotiation was opposed and defeated by the hostile arts of Antoninus, 52, a Roman subject of Syria, who had fled from oppression and was admitted into the councils of Sapor, and even to the royal table, where, according to the custom of the Persians, the most important business was frequently discussed. 53. The dexterous fugitive promoted his interest by the same conduct which gratified his revenge. He incessantly urged the ambition of his new master to embrace the favorable opportunity when the bravest of the Palatine troops were employed with the emperor in a distant war on the Danube. He pressed Sapor to invade the exhausted and defenseless provinces of the east with the numerous armies of Persia, now fortified by the alliance and accession of the fiercest barbarians. The ambassadors of Rome retired without success, and a second embassy, of a still more honorable rank, was detained in strict confinement and threatened either with death or exile. 50. Transcribes the haughty letter. Themistius Orat. Themistius Orat. EVP 57, edit. Petavi takes notice of the silken covering. Idatius and Zonaras mention the journey of the ambassador, and Peter the patrician, in excerpt. Legat. P58 has informed us of his behavior. 50 on return, Ammianus, 17. The sophist or philosopher in that age, these words were almost synonymous, was Eustathius the Cappadocian, the disciple of Jamblichus and the friend of St. Basil. Eunapius in VE. Edisi, P4447, fondly attributes to this philosophic ambassador the glory of enchanting the barbarian king by the persuasive charms of reason and eloquence. See Tillemont, Hist, des Empereurs, Tom, IFEP A 2022. 52 Return Amiens, 18. 5, 6, 8. The decent and respectful behavior of Antoninus towards the Roman general sets him in a very interesting light, and Ammianus himself speaks of the traitor with some compassion and esteem. 53 Return. This circumstance, as it is noticed by Ammianus, serves to prove the veracity of Herodotus, ELI, c. 43.3, and the permanency of the Persian manners. In every age, the Persians have been addicted to intemperance, and the wines of Shiraz have triumphed over the law of Mahomet. Brisson de Regnault Piers, L2p 462-472, and Voyages en Piers, Tom 3p 90. The military historian, 54, who was himself dispatched to observe the army of the Persians as they were preparing to construct a bridge of boats over the Tigris, beheld from an eminence the plain of Assyria as far as the edge of the horizon, covered with men, with horses, and with arms. Sapor appeared in the front, conspicuous by the splendor of his purple. On his left hand, the place of honor among the Orientals, Grumbates, king of the Chionites, displayed the stern countenance of an aged and renowned warrior. The monarch had reserved a similar place on his right hand for the king of the Albanians, who led his independent tribes from the shores of the Caspian. 5411. The satraps and generals were distributed according to their several ranks, and the whole army, besides the numerous train of Oriental luxury, consisted of more than 100,000 effective men, inured to fatigue and selected from the bravest nations of Asia. The Roman deserter, who in some measure guided the counsels of Sapor, had prudently advised that, instead of wasting the summer in tedious and difficult sieges, he should march directly to the Euphrates and press forwards without delay to seize the feeble and wealthy metropolis of Syria. But the Persians were no sooner advanced into the plains of Mesopotamia than they discovered that every precaution had been used which could retard their progress or defeat their design. The inhabitants, with their cattle, were secured in places of strength. The green forage throughout the country was set on fire. The fords of the rivers were fortified by sharp stakes, military engines were planted on the opposite banks, and a seasonable swell of the waters of the Euphrates deterred the barbarians from attempting the ordinary passage of the bridge of Thapsacus. Their skillful guide, changing his plan of operations, then conducted the army by a longer circuit, but through a fertile territory, towards the head of the Euphrates, where the infant river is reduced to a shallow and accessible stream. Sapor overlooked with prudent disdain the strength of Nisibis. But as he passed under the walls of Amida, he resolved to try whether the majesty of his presence would not awe the garrison into immediate submission. The sacrilegious insult of a random dart which glanced against the royal tiara convinced him of his error, and the indignant monarch listened with impatience to the advice of his ministers, who conjured him not to sacrifice the success of his ambition to the gratification of his resentment. The following day, Grumbates advanced towards the gates with a select body of troops and required the instant surrender of the city as the only atonement which could be accepted for such an act of rashness and insolence. His proposals were answered by a general discharge, and his only son, a beautiful and valiant youth, was pierced through the heart by a javelin shot from one of the ballistae. The funeral of the prince of the Chionites was celebrated according to the rites of the country, and the grief of his aged father was alleviated by the solemn promise of Sapor that the guilty city of Amida should serve as a funeral pile to expiate the death and to perpetuate the memory of his son. 5411. Return. These perhaps were the barbarous tribes who inhabit the northern part of the present Shirwan, the Albania of the ancients. This country, now inhabited by the Legis, the terror of the neighboring districts, was then occupied by the same people, called by the ancients Lege, by the Armenians Geg or Leg. The latter represent them as constant allies of the Persians in their wars against Armenia and the Empire. A little after this period, a certain Shirgir was their king, and it is of him doubtless Ammianus Marcellinus speaks. St. Martin, 285. The ancient city of Amid or Amida, 55, which sometimes assumes the provincial appellation of Diyarbakir. 56 is advantageously situate in a fertile plain, watered by the natural and artificial channels of the Tigris, of which the least inconsiderable stream bends in a semicircular form round the eastern part of the city. The Emperor Constantius had recently conferred on Amida the honor of his own name and the additional fortifications of strong walls and lofty towers. It was provided with an arsenal of military engines, and the ordinary garrison had been reinforced to the amount of 7 legions when the place was invested by the arms of Sapor. 57. His first and most sanguine hopes depended on the success of a general assault. To the several nations which followed his standard, their respective posts were assigned, the south to the Vertai, the north to the Albanians, the east to the Chionites, inflamed with grief and indignation, the west to the Sigestans, the bravest of his warriors, who covered their front with a formidable line of Indian elephants. 58. The Persians on every side supported their efforts and animated their courage, and the monarch himself, careless of his rank and safety, displayed, in the prosecution of the siege, the ardor of a youthful soldier. After an obstinate combat, the barbarians were repulsed. They incessantly returned to the charge. They were again driven back with a dreadful slaughter, and 2 rebel legions of Gauls, who had been banished into the east, signalized their undisciplined courage by a nocturnal sally into the heart of the Persian camp. In one of the fiercest of these repeated assaults, Amida was betrayed by the treachery of a deserter, who indicated to the barbarians a secret and neglected staircase scooped out of the rock that hangs over the stream of the Tigris. 70 chosen archers of the royal guard ascended in silence to the 3rd story of a lofty tower, which commanded the precipice. They elevated on high the Persian banner, the signal of confidence to the assailants and of dismay to the besieged, and if this devoted band could have maintained their post a few minutes longer, the reduction of the place might have been purchased by the sacrifice of their lives. After Sapor had tried, without success, the efficacy of force and of stratagem, he had recourse to the slower but more certain operations of a regular siege, in the conduct of which he was instructed by the skill of the Roman deserters. The trenches were opened at a convenient distance, and the troops destined for that service advanced under the portable cover of strong hurdles to fill out the ditch and undermine the foundations of the walls. Wooden towers were at the same time constructed and moved forwards on wheels, till the soldiers, who were provided with every species of missile weapons, could engage almost on level ground with the troops who defended the rampart. Every mode of resistance which art could suggest or courage could execute was employed in the defense of Amida, and the works of Sapor were more than once destroyed by the fire of the Romans. But the resources of a besieged city may be exhausted. The Persians repaired their losses and pushed their approaches. A large breach was made by the battering ram, and the strength of the garrison, wasted by the sword and by disease, yielded to the fury of the assault. The soldiers, the citizens, their wives, their children, all who had not time to escape through the opposite gate, were involved by the conquerors in a promiscuous massacre. 55. Return. For the description of Amida, see de Herbelot, Bibliothèque Orientale, P. Bibliothèque Orientale, P. Tuere de Timur, Bikpa, Sherefeddin Ali, L3C, 41. Ahmed Rabsiades, Tom, IP 331, C43, Voyages de Tavernier, Tom, IP 31, Voyages d'Auteur, Tom, 2P273, and Voyages de Niebuhr, Tom. 2, P32 4328. The learned and accurate Dane has given a plan of Amida, which illustrates the operations of the siege. 56. Return to Diyarbakir, which is styled Amid or Kara Amid in the public writings of the Turks, contains above 3 tales. The epithet of Karai is derived from the blackness of the stone which composes the strong and ancient wall of Amida. In my mem. Hist. sur l'Armenia, LIP 6673, I conceive that I have proved this city, still called, by the Armenians, Dürkranager, the city of Tigranes, to be the same with the famous Tigranocerta, of which the situation was unknown. St. Martin, I 432. On the siege of Amida, see St. Martin's Notes 2-290. Faustus of Byzantium, nearly a contemporary, Armenian, states that the Persians, on becoming masters of it, destroyed 40,000 houses, though Ammianus describes the city as of no great extent, civitatis ambitum non nimium ample. Besides the ordinary population and those who took refuge from the country, it contained 2,000 soldiers. St. Martin 2-290. This interpretation is extremely doubtful. Wagner note on Ammianus considers the whole population to amount only to M57 return. The operations of the siege of Amida are very minutely described by Ammianus 19:19, who acted an honorable part in the defense and escaped with difficulty when the city was stormed by the Persians. The 58 return. Of these 4 nations, the Albanians are too well known to require any description. The Segestans Sakastene, St. Martin, inhabited a large and level country which still preserves their name to the south of Khorasan and the west of Hindostan. See Geographia Nubiensis, p. 433, and Derbelot, Bibliothèque Orientale, p. 797, notwithstanding the boasted victory of Bahram Vivol. IP 410, the Segestans, above 80 years afterwards, appear as an independent nation, the ally of Persia. We are ignorant of the situation of the Vertai and Chionites, but I am inclined to place them, at least the latter, towards the confines of India and Scythia. See Amiens. Klaproth considers the real Albanians the same with the ancient Alani, and quotes a passage of the Emperor Julian in support of his opinion. They are the Ossetai, now inhabiting part of Caucasus. Tableau Hist. de Lazy p. 79-80, M9. The Vertai are still unknown. It is possible that the Chionites are the same as the Huns. These people were already known, and we find from Armenian authors that they were making, at this period, incursions into Asia. They were often at war with the Persians. The name was perhaps pronounced differently in the east and in the west, and this prevents us from recognizing it. St. Martin, 2:17-7. Memna was the safety of the Roman provinces. As soon as the first transports of victory had subsided, Sapor was at leisure to reflect that to chastise a disobedient city, he had lost the flower of his troops and the most favorable season for conquest. 30,000 of his veterans had fallen under the walls of Amida during the continuance of a siege which lasted 73 days, and the disappointed monarch returned to his capital with affected triumph and secret mortification. It is more than probable that the inconstancy of his barbarian allies was tempted to relinquish a war in which they had encountered such unexpected difficulties, and that the aged king of the Chionites, satiated with revenge, turned away with horror from a scene of action where he had been deprived of the hope of his family and nation. The strength, as well as the spirit, of the army with which Sapor took the field in the ensuing spring was no longer equal to the unbounded views of his ambition. Instead of aspiring to the conquest of the East, he was obliged to content himself with the reduction of 2 fortified cities of Mesopotamia, Singara and Bezabde, 60, the one situate in the midst of a sandy desert, the other in a small peninsula, surrounded almost on every side by the deep and rapid stream of the Tigris. 5 Roman legions, of the diminutive size to which they had been reduced in the age of Constantine, were made prisoners and sent into remote captivity on the extreme confines of Persia. After dismantling the walls of Singara, the conqueror abandoned that solitary and sequestered place, but he carefully restored the fortifications of Bezabde and fixed in that important post a garrison or colony of veterans, amply supplied with every means of defense and animated by high sentiments of honor and fidelity. Towards the close of the campaign, the arms of Sapor incurred some disgrace by an unsuccessful enterprise against Vertha, or Tikrit, a strong, or, as it was universally esteemed till the age of Tamerlane, an impregnable fortress of the independent Arabs. 61-611 return. Ammianus has marked the chronology of this year by 3 signs, which do not perfectly coincide with each other or with the series of the history. First, the corn was ripe when Sapor invaded Mesopotamia, cum jam stipula flavate turgerent, a circumstance which, in the latitude of Aleppo, would naturally refer us to the month of April or May. See Harmer's Observations on Scripture, Vol. EP 41. Shaw's Travels, p. 335, edit 42. 2. The progress of Sapor was checked by the overflowing of the Euphrates, which generally happens in July and August. Plin, Hist, Nat. v. 21. Viaggi di Pietro della Valle, Tum, IP 696. 3. When Sapor had taken Amida, after a siege of 73 days, the autumn was far advanced. Autumno precipiti haederunque improbo sidere exorto. To reconcile these apparent contradictions, we must allow for some delay in the Persian king, some inaccuracy in the historian. The account of these sieges is given by Ammianus, XX 6, 7. The Christian bishop of Bezabde went to the camp of the king of Persia to persuade him to check the waste of human blood. Belm. Mer XX 7. Mel. 6-1 return. For the identity of Vertha and Tekrit, see Dalville, Geography. For the siege of that castle by Timur Bek or Tamerlane, see Shahefeden, L3, C33. The Persian biographer exaggerates the merit and difficulty of this exploit, which delivered the caravans of Baghdad from a formidable gang of robbers. 6111 return. St. Martin doubts whether it lay so much to the south. The word Goethe means in Syriac a castle or fortress, and might be applied to many places. The defense of the East against the arms of Sapor required, and would have exercised, the abilities of the most consummate general, and it seemed fortunate for the state that it was the actual province of the brave Ursicinus who alone deserved the confidence of the soldiers and people. In the hour of danger, 62 Ursicinus was removed from his station by the intrigues of the eunuchs, and the military command of the East was bestowed by the same influence on Sabinian, a wealthy and subtle veteran who had attained the infirmities without acquiring the experience of age. By a second order, which issued from the same jealous and inconstant councils, Ursicinus was again dispatched to the frontier of Mesopotamia, and condemned to sustain the labors of a war, the honors of which had been transferred to his unworthy rival. Sabinian fixed his indolent station under the walls of Edessa, and while he amused himself with the idle parade of military exercise and moved to the sound of flutes in the Pyrrhic dance, the public defense was abandoned to the boldness and diligence of the former general of the East. But whenever Ursicinus recommended any vigorous plan of operations, when he proposed, at the head of a light and active army, to wheel round the foot of the mountains to intercept the convoys of the enemy, to harass the wide extent of the Persian lines, and to relieve the distress of Amida, the timid and envious commander alleged that he was restrained by his positive orders from endangering the safety of the troops. Amida was at length taken. Its bravest defenders, who had escaped the sword of the barbarians, died in the Roman camp by the hand of the executioner, and Ursicinus himself, after supporting the disgrace of a partial inquiry, was punished for the misconduct of Sabinian by the loss of his military rank. But Constantius soon experienced the truth of the prediction which honest indignation had extorted from his injured lieutenant, that as long as such maxims of government was suffered to prevail, the emperor himself would find it is no easy task to defend his eastern dominions from the invasion of a foreign enemy. When he had subdued or pacified the barbarians of the Danube, Constantius proceeded by slow marches into the east, and after he had wept over the smoking ruins of Amida, he formed, with a powerful army, the siege of Becabde. The walls were shaken by the reiterated efforts of the most enormous of the battering rams. The town was reduced to the last extremity, but it was still defended by the patient and intrepid valor of the garrison, till the approach of the rainy season obliged the emperor to raise the siege, and ingloriously to retreat into his winter quarters at Antioch. 63. The pride of Constantius and the ingenuity of his courtiers were at a loss to discover any materials for panegyric in the events of the Persian War, while the glory of his cousin Julian, to whose military command he had entrusted the provinces of Gaul, was proclaimed to the world in the simple and concise narrative of his exploits. 62. Return. Ammianus, 18. 5. 619. 3. 20. True represents the merit and disgrace of Ursicinus with that faithful attention which a soldier owed to his general. Some partiality may be suspected, yet the whole account is consistent and probable. 63. Return. Ammian. XX 90. Incepto hiamaturus Antiochiae, reddit in Syriam, Aron nosam, perpessus et Urtia, Duke de Flenda. It is thus quas that James Grenovius has restored an obscure passage, and he thinks that this correction alone would have deserved a new edition of his author, whose sense may now be darkly perceived. I expected some additional light from the recent labors of the learned Ernestus, Lipsii, 1773. Note: the late editor Wagner has nothing better to suggest, and lamenta with Gibbon the silence of Ernesti. In the blind fury of civil discord, Constantius had abandoned to the barbarians of Germany the countries of Gaul, which still acknowledged the authority of his rival. A numerous swarm of Franks and Alemanni were invited to cross the Rhine by presents and promises, by the hopes of spoil, and by a perpetual grant of all the territories which they should be able to subdue. 64. But the emperor, who for a temporary service had thus imprudently provoked the rapacious spirit of the barbarians, soon discovered and lamented the difficulty of dismissing these formidable allies after they had tasted the richness of the Roman soil. Regardless of the nice distinction of loyalty and rebellion, these undisciplined robbers treated as their natural enemies all the subjects of the empire, who possessed any property which they were desirous of acquiring. 45 flourishing cities, Tongres, Cologne, Treves, Worms, Spires, Strasbourg, and C, besides a far greater number of towns and villages, were pillaged and for the most part reduced to ashes. The barbarians of Germany, still faithful to the maxims of their ancestors, abhorred the confinement of walls, to which they applied the odious names of prisons and sepulchres, and fixing their independent habitations on the banks of rivers, the Rhine, the Moselle, and the Meuse, they secured themselves against the danger of a surprise by a rude and hasty fortification of large trees, which were felled and thrown across the roads. The Alemanni were established in the modern countries of Alsace and Lorraine. The Franks occupied the island of the Batavians, together with an extensive district of Brabant, which was then known by the appellation of Toxandria, 65, and may deserve to be considered as the original seat of their Gallic monarchy. 66. From the sources to the mouth of the Rhine, the conquests of the Germans extended above 40 miles to the west of that river, over a country peopled by colonies of their own name and nation, and the scene of their devastations was 3 times more extensive than that of their conquests. At a still greater distance, the open towns of Gaul were deserted, and the inhabitants of the fortified cities, who trusted to their strength and vigilance, were obliged to content themselves with such supplies of corn as they could raise on the vacant land within the enclosure of their walls. The diminished legions, destitute of pay and provisions, of arms and discipline, trembled at the approach, and even at the name, of the barbarians. 64. Return. The ravages of the Germans and the distress of Gaul may be collected from Julian himself, Orat, XPQ Athen, 15 Shefty 3p. 40 CL, Mamerton, Grat, Art, CEV 65 Return, Ammianus 16. 8. This name seems to be derived from the Toxandria of Pliny and very frequently occurs in the histories of the Middle Age. Toxandria was a country of woods and morasses which extended from the neighborhood of Tongres to the conflux of the Vahal and the Rhine. See Valesius, Notiti, Gallier, p. 5058. 66th Return. The paradox of P. Daniel, that the Franks never obtained any permanent settlement on this side of the Rhine before the time of Clovis, is refuted with much learning and good sense by M. Beat, who has proved by a chain of evidence their uninterrupted possession of Toxandria 130 years before the accession of Ammianus. Beat was crowned by the Academy of Soissons in the year 1736, and seems to have been justly preferred to the discourse of his more celebrated competitor, the Abbé Leboeuf, an antiquarian whose name was happily expressive of his talents. Chapter 19. Constantius Sole Emperor. Part 4. Under these melancholy circumstances, an unexperienced youth was appointed to save and to govern the provinces of Gaul, or rather, as he expressed it himself, to exhibit the vain image of imperial greatness. The retired scholastic education of Julian, in which he had been more conversant with books than with arms, with the dead than with the living, left him in profound ignorance of the practical arts of war and government, and when he awkwardly repeated some military exercise which it was necessary for him to learn, he exclaimed with a sigh, "O Plato, Plato, what a task for a philosopher!" Yet even this speculative philosophy, which men of business are too apt to despise, had filled the mind of Julian with the noblest precepts and the most shining examples, had animated him with the love of virtue, the desire of fame, and the contempt of death. The habits of temperance recommended in the schools are still more essential in the severe discipline of a camp. The simple wants of nature regulated the measure of his food and sleep. Rejecting with disdain the delicacies provided for his table, he satisfied his appetite with the coarse and common fare which was allotted to the meanest soldiers. During the rigor of a Gallic winter, he never suffered a fire in his bedchamber, and after a short and interrupted slumber, he frequently rose in the middle of the night from a carpet spread on the floor, to dispatch any urgent business, to visit his rounds, or to steal a few moments for the prosecution of his favorite studies. 67. The precepts of eloquence, which he had hitherto practiced on fancied topics of declamation, were more usefully applied to excite or to assuage the passions of an armed multitude, and although Julian, from his early habits of conversation and literature, was more familiarly acquainted with the beauties of the Greek language, he had attained a competent knowledge of the Latin tongue. 68. Since Julian was not originally designed for the character of a legislator or a judge, it is probable that the civil jurisprudence of the Romans had not engaged any considerable share of his attention, but he derived from his philosophic studies an inflexible regard for justice, tempered by a disposition to clemency, the knowledge of the general principles of equity and evidence, and the faculty of patiently investigating the most intricate and tedious questions which could be proposed for his discussion. The measures of policy and the operations of war must submit to the various accidents of circumstance and character, and the unpracticed student will often be perplexed in the application of the most perfect theory. But in the acquisition of this important science, Julian was assisted by the active vigor of his own genius, as well as by the wisdom and experience of Sallust, an officer of rank, who soon conceived a sincere attachment for a prince so worthy of his friendship, and whose incorruptible integrity was adorned by the talent of insinuating the harshest truths without wounding the delicacy of a royal ear. 69-67 Return. The private life of Julian in Gaul and the severe discipline which he embraced are displayed by Ammianus, 16:5, who professes to praise, and by Julian himself, who affects to ridicule, misopogon, p. 340, a conduct which, in a prince of the house of Constantine, might justly excite the surprise of mankind. 68. Return. Aderat Latin quoque disserenti sufficiens, sermo. Ammianus, 16. But Julian, educated in the schools of Greece, always considered the language of the Romans as a foreign and popular dialect which he might use on necessary occasions. 99 Returned. We are ignorant of the actual office of this excellent minister, whom Julian afterwards created prefect of Gaul. Sallust was speedily recalled by the jealousy of the emperor, and we may still read a sensible but pedantic discourse, p.e. 240-252, in which Julian deplores the loss of so valuable a friend, to whom he acknowledges himself indebted for his reputation. See La Bletterie, Preface, à la vie de Lovien, p. 20. Immediately after Julian had received the purple at Milan, he was sent into Gaul with a feeble retinue of 360 soldiers. At Vienna, where he passed a painful and anxious winter in the hands of those ministers to whom Constantius had entrusted the direction of his conduct, the Caesar was informed of the siege and deliverance of Autun. That large and ancient city, protected only by a ruined wall and pusillanimous garrison, was saved by the generous resolution of a few veterans who resumed their arms for the defense of their country. In his march from Autun through the heart of the Gallic provinces, Julian embraced with ardor the earliest opportunity of signalizing his courage. At the head of a small body of archers and heavy cavalry, he preferred the shorter but the more dangerous of two roads, 6911, and sometimes eluding, and sometimes resisting, the attacks of the barbarians, who were masters of the field. He arrived with honor and safety at the camp near Rheims, where the Roman troops had been ordered to assemble. The aspect of their young prince revived the drooping spirits of the soldiers, and they marched from Rheims in search of the enemy with a confidence which had almost proved fatal to them. The Alemanni, familiarized to the knowledge of the country, secretly collected their scattered forces, and seizing the opportunity of a dark and rainy day, poured with unexpected fury on the rear guard of the Romans. Before the inevitable disorder could be remedied, 2 legions were destroyed, and Julian was taught by experience that caution and vigilance are the most important lessons of the art of war. In a second and more successful action, he recovered and established his military fame. But as the agility of the barbarians saved them from the pursuit, his victory was neither bloody nor decisive. He advanced, however, to the banks of the Rhine, surveyed the ruins of Cologne, convinced himself of the difficulties of the war, and retreated on the approach of winter, discontented with the court, with his army, and with his own success. 70. The power of the enemy was yet unbroken, and the Caesar had no sooner separated his troops and fixed his own quarters at Sens, in the center of Gaul, than he was surrounded and besieged by a numerous host of Germans. Reduced, in this extremity, to the resources of his own mind, he displayed a prudent intrepidity, which compensated for all the deficiencies of the place and garrison, and the barbarians, at the end of 30 days, were obliged to retire with disappointed rage. 691 Return, alis per arba, quibus dam per seder locum et coram in debere ferantibus. Arbor. Sedellanus is Soulieu, a small town of the department of the Côte d'Or, 6 leagues from Autun. Cora answers to the village of Coix, on the river of the same name, between Autun and Nevrefort. Martin, 2.62, Mem. Note, at Brocamages, Brumat, near Strasbourg, St. Martin, 2.4. Mem. 70, Return 84. Mem 73. Memmianus 16. 2-3 appears much better satisfied with the success of his first campaign than Julian himself, who very fairly owns that he did nothing of consequence and that he fled before the enemy. The conscious pride of Julian, who was indebted only to his sword for this signal deliverance, was embittered by the reflection that he was abandoned, betrayed, and perhaps devoted to destruction by those who were bound to assist him by every tie of honor and fidelity. Marcellus, master general of the cavalry in Gaul, interpreting too strictly the jealous orders of the court, beheld with supine indifference the distress of Julian, and had restrained the troops under his command from marching to the relief of Sens. If the Caesar had dissembled in silence so dangerous an insult, his person and authority would have been exposed to the contempt of the world. And if an action so criminal had been suffered to pass with impunity, the emperor would have confirmed the suspicions which received a very specious color from his past conduct towards the princes of the Flavian family. Marcellus was recalled and gently dismissed from his office. 71. In his room, Severus was appointed general of the cavalry, an experienced soldier, of approved courage and fidelity, who could advise with respect and execute with zeal, and who submitted without reluctance to the supreme command which Julian, by the in-rest of his patroness Eusebia, at length obtained over the armies of Gaul. 72. A very judicious plan of operations was adopted for the approaching campaign. Julian himself, at the head of the remains of the veteran bands and of some new levies which he had been permitted to form, boldly penetrated into the center of the German cantonments and carefully re-established the fortifications of Saverne in an advantageous post which would either check the incursions or intercept the retreat of the enemy. At the same time, Barbatio, general of the infantry, advanced from Milan with an army of 30,000 men, and passing the mountains, prepared to throw a bridge over the Rhine in the neighborhood of Basel. It was reasonable to expect that the Alemanni, pressed on either side by the Roman arms, would soon be forced to evacuate the provinces of Gaul and to hasten to the defense of their native country. But the hopes of the campaign were defeated by the incapacity, or the envy, or the secret instructions of Barbatio, who acted as if he had been the enemy of the Caesar and the secret ally of the barbarians. The negligence with which he permitted a troop of pillagers freely to pass and to return almost before the gates of his camp may be imputed to his want of abilities, but the treasonable act of burning a number of boats and a superfluous stock of provisions, which would have been of the most essential service to the army of Gaul, was an evidence of his hostile and criminal intentions. The Germans despised an enemy who appeared destitute either of power or of inclination to offend them, and the ignominious retreat of Barbatio deprived Julian of the expected support and left him to extricate himself from a hazardous situation where he could neither remain with safety nor retire with honor. 73-71. Return. Amiens. 16-7. Libanius speaks rather more advantageously of the military talents of Marcellus Orat, XP section 2724. And Julian insinuates that he would not have been so easily recalled unless he had given other reasons of offense to the court. P. 278 to return. Severus non discors non arrogans sed longa militiae frugalitate compertus et ium recta praeuntum secuturus ut tuetorum morigeren miles. Amiens. 16-11. Zosimus. L3. P. 40. 73. Return. On the design and failure of the cooperation between Julian and Barbatio, see Ammianus 16-11 and Libanius Orati. XP 273. Note: Barbatio seems to have allowed himself to be surprised and defeated. As soon as they were delivered from the fears of invasion, the Alemanni prepared to chastise the Roman youth who presumed to dispute the possession of that country, which they claimed as their own by the right of conquest and of treaties. They employed 3 days and as many nights in transporting over the Rhine their military powers. The fierce Schnodomar, shaking the ponderous javelin which he had victoriously wielded against the brother of Magnentius, led the van of the barbarians, and moderated by his experience the martial ardor which his example inspired. 74. He was followed by 6 other kings, by 10 princes of regal extraction, by a long train of high-spirited nobles, and by 35,000 of the bravest warriors of the tribes of Germany. The confidence derived from the view of their own strength was increased by the intelligence which they received from a deserter that the Caesar, with a feeble army of 13,000 men, occupied a post about 21 miles from their camp of Strasbourg. With this inadequate force, Julian resolved to seek and to encounter the barbarian host, and the chance of a general action was preferred to the tedious and uncertain operation of separately engaging the dispersed parties of the Alemanni. The Romans marched in close order, and in 2 columns, the cavalry on the right, the infantry on the left, and the day was so far spent when they appeared in sight of the enemy that Julian was desirous of deferring the battle till the next morning, and of allowing his troops to recruit their exhausted strength by the necessary refreshments of sleep and food. Yielding, however, with some reluctance to the clamors of the soldiers and even to the opinion of his council, he exhorted them to justify by their valor the eager impatience which, in case of a defeat, would be universally branded with the epithets of rashness and presumption. The trumpets sounded, the military shout was heard through the field, and the 2 armies rushed with equal fury to the charge. The Caesar, who conducted in person his right wing, depended on the dexterity of his archers and the weight of his cuirassiers. But his ranks were instantly broken by an irregular mixture of light horse and of light infantry, and he had the mortification of beholding the flight of 600 of his most renowned cuirassiers. 75. The fugitives were stopped and rallied by the presence and authority of Julian, who, careless of his own safety, threw himself before them, and urging every motive of shame and honor, led them back against the victorious enemy. The conflict between the 2 lines of infantry was obstinate and bloody. The Germans possessed the superiority of strength and stature, the Romans that of discipline and temper, and, as the barbarians who served under the standard of the empire, united the respective advantages of both parties, their strenuous efforts, guided by a skillful leader, at length determined the event of the day. The Romans lost 4 tribunes and 243 soldiers in this memorable battle of Strasbourg, so glorious to the Caesar, 76 and so salutary to the afflicted provinces of Gaul. 6,000 of the Alemanni were slain in the field, without including those who were drowned in the Rhine or transfixed with darts while they attempted to swim across the river. 77 Chnodomar himself was surrounded and taken prisoner, with 3 of his brave companions, who had devoted themselves to follow in life or death the fate of their chieftain. Julian received him with military pomp in the council of his officers, and expressing a generous pity for the fallen state, dissembled his inward contempt for the abject humiliation of his captive. Instead of exhibiting the vanquished king of the Alemanni as a grateful spectacle to the cities of Gaul, he respectfully laid at the feet of the emperor this splendid trophy of his victory. Chnodomar experienced an honorable treatment, but the impatient barbarian could not long survive his defeat, his confinement, and his exile. 78-74 Return. Ammianus, 16. 12 describes with his inflated eloquence the figure and character of Chnodomar. Audax et fidans ingenti robor lacertorum, ubi ardor praeliae sperabatur imanis, ecus brumante sublimior, erectus in jaculum formidandae vastitatis, amorum cernitore conspicuous et mila, et utilis pretaceteros tuctar. Decentium Caesarum superavet aquo Marte congressus. To 75 returned the Trivi. After the battle, Julian ventured to revive the rigor of ancient discipline by exposing these fugitives in female apparel to the derision of the whole camp. In the next campaign, these troops nobly retrieved their honor. Zosimus, L3p. 42 to 76 returned to Julian himself ad SPQ Athen. P279 speaks of the Battle of Strasbourg with the modesty of conscious merit. Zosimus compares it with the victory of Alexander over Darius, and yet we are at a loss to discover any of those strokes of military genius which fix the attention of ages on the conduct and success of a single day. To 77 return. Ammianus, 16. 12. Libanius adds 2,000 more to the number of the slain, or at Exper 2070. 41. We might attribute this extravagant number to the carelessness of transcribers if this credulous or partial historian had not swelled the army of 35,000 Alemanni to an innumerable multitude of barbarians. It is our own fault if this detection does not inspire us with proper distrust on similar occasions. After Julian had repulsed the Alemanni from the provinces of the Upper Rhine, he turned his arms against the Franks, who were seated nearer to the ocean, on the confines of Gaul and Germany, and who, from their numbers and still more from their intrepid valor, had ever been esteemed the most formidable of the barbarians. 79. Although they were strongly actuated by the allurements of rapine, they professed a disinterested love of war, which they considered as the supreme honor and felicity of human nature, and their minds and bodies were so completely hardened by perpetual action that, according to the lively expression of an orator, the snows of winter were as pleasant to them as the flowers of spring. In the month of December, which followed the Battle of Strasbourg, Julian attacked a body of 600 Franks, who had thrown themselves into two castles on the Meuse. 80. In the midst of that severe season they sustained, with inflexible constancy, a siege of 54 days, till at length, exhausted by hunger, and satisfied that the vigilance of the enemy, in breaking the ice of the river, left them no hopes of escape, the Franks consented for the first time to dispense with the ancient law which commanded them to conquer or to die. The Caesar immediately sent his captives to the court of Constantius, who, accepting them as a valuable present, 81 rejoiced in the opportunity of adding so many heroes to the choicest troops of his domestic guards. The obstinate resistance of this handful of Franks apprised Julian of the difficulties of the expedition which he meditated for the ensuing spring against the whole body of the nation. His rapid diligence surprised and astonished the active barbarians. Ordering his soldiers to provide themselves with biscuit for 20 days, he suddenly pitched his camp near Tongres, while the enemy still supposed him in his winter quarters of Paris, expecting the slow arrival of his convoys from Aquitaine. Without allowing the Franks to unite or deliberate, he skillfully spread his legions from Cologne to the ocean, and by the terror, as well as by the success, of his arms, soon reduced the suppliant tribes to implore the clemency, and to obey the commands of their conqueror. The Chamavians submissively retired to their former habitations beyond the Rhine, but the Salians were permitted to possess their new establishment of Toxandria as the subjects and auxiliaries of the Roman Empire. 82. The treaty was ratified by solemn oaths, and perpetual inspectors were appointed to reside among the Franks, with the authority of enforcing the strict observance of the conditions. An incident is related, interesting enough in itself, and by no means repugnant to the character of Julian, who ingeniously contrived both the plot and the catastrophe of the tragedy. When the Chamavians sued for peace, he required the son of their king as the only hostage on whom he could rely. A mournful silence, interrupted by tears and groans, declared the sad perplexity of the barbarians, and their aged chief lamented in pathetic language that his private loss was now embittered by a sense of public calamity. While the Chamavians lay prostrate at the foot of his throne, the royal captive, whom they believed to have been slain, unexpectedly appeared before their eyes, and as soon as the tumult of joy was hushed into attention, the Caesar addressed the assembly in the following terms: "Behold the son, the prince whom you wept. You had lost him by your fault. God and the Romans have restored him to you. I shall still preserve and educate the youth, rather as a monument of my own virtue than as a pledge of your sincerity. Should you presume to violate the faith which you have sworn, the arms of the Republic will avenge the perfidy, not on the innocent, but on the guilty." The barbarians withdrew from his presence, impressed with the warmest sentiments of gratitude and admiration. 83-79 Su Libanius. Orat. 3. p. 37 draws a very lively picture of the manners of the Franks. 80 Return. Ammianus, 17. 2. Libanius, Orat, XP 278. The Greek orator, by misapprehending a passage of Julian, has been induced to represent the Franks as consisting of 1,000 men, and as his head was always full of the Peloponnesian War, he compares them to the Lacedaemonians, who were besieged and taken in the island of Sphatoria. 81. Returned Julian. At SPQ, Athen, p. 280. Libanius, Orat, XP 278. According to the expression of Libanius, the emperor, which La Blettere understands, via de Julian, p. 180, as an honest confession, and Valesius as a mean evasion of the truth. Dombouquet, Historians de France, Tombifi 73, by substituting another word, would suppress both the difficulty and the spirit, Monamin 17. 46-55. His narrative is darkened by a mixture of fable and Julian at SPQ Athen, p. 280. His expression, "This difference of treatment confirms the opinion that the Salian Franks were permitted to retain the settlements in Toxandria." Note, a newly discovered fragment of Eunapius, whom Zosimus probably transcribed, illustrates this transaction. Julian commanded the Romans to abstain from all hostile measures against the Salians, neither to waste or ravage their own country, for he called every country their own which was surrendered without resistance or toil on the part of the conquerors. My script, Vez Nov, collect. 256, and Eunapius in Niebuhr, Byzant, Hist. 83, returned. This interesting story, which Zosimus has abridged, is related by Eunapius in excerpt. Legationum p. 15, 16, 17. With all the amplifications of Grecian rhetoric, but the silence of Libanius, of Ammianus, and of Julian himself renders the truth of it extremely suspicious. It was not enough for Julian to have delivered the provinces of Gaul from the barbarians of Germany. He aspired to emulate the glory of the first and most illustrious of the emperors, after whose example he composed his own commentaries of the Gallic War. 84. Caesar has related with conscious pride the manner in which he twice passed the Rhine. Julian could boast that before he assumed the title of Augustus, he had carried the Roman eagles beyond that great river in the 3 successful expeditions. 85. The consternation of the Germans, after the Battle of Strasbourg, encouraged him to the first attempt, and the reluctance of the troops soon yielded to the persuasive eloquence of a leader who shared the fatigues and dangers which he imposed on the meanest of the soldiers. The villages on either side of the Main, which were plentifully stored with corn and cattle, felt the ravages of an invading army. The principal houses, constructed with some imitation of Roman elegance, were consumed by the flames, and the Caesar boldly advanced about 10 miles, till his progress was stopped by a dark and impenetrable forest, undermined by subterraneous passages, which threatened with secret snares and ambush every step of the assailants. The ground was already covered with snow, and Julian, after repairing an ancient castle which had been erected by Trajan, granted a truce of 10 months to the submissive barbarians. At the expiration of the truce, Julian undertook a second expedition beyond the Rhine to humble the pride of Sumar and Hortaire, 2 of the kings of the Alemanni who had been present at the Battle of Strasbourg. They promised to restore all the Roman captives who yet remained alive, and as the Caesar had procured an exact account from the cities and villages of Gaul of the inhabitants whom they had lost, he detected every attempt to deceive him with a degree of readiness and accuracy which almost established the belief of his supernatural knowledge. His third expedition was still more splendid and important than the 2 former. The Germans had collected their military powers and moved along the opposite banks of the river with the design of destroying the bridge and of preventing the passage of the Romans. But this judicious plan of defense was disconcerted by a skillful diversion. 300 light-armed and active soldiers were detached in 40 small boats to fall down the stream in silence and to land at some distance from the posts of the enemy. They executed their orders with so much boldness and celerity that they had almost surprised the barbarian chiefs who returned in the fearless confidence of intoxication from one of their nocturnal festivals. Without repeating the uniform and disgusting tale of slaughter and devastation, it is sufficient to observe that Julian dictated his own conditions of peace to 6 of the haughtiest kings of the Alemanni, 3 of whom were permitted to view the severe discipline and martial pomp of a Roman camp. Followed by 20,000 captives whom he had rescued from the chains of the barbarians, the Caesar repassed the Rhine after terminating a war, the success of which has been compared to the ancient glories of the Punic and Cimbric victories. 84. Return Libanius, the friend of Julian, clearly insinuates Orat. 9. p. 17:8, that his hero had composed the history of his Gallic campaigns, but Zosimus Ilelelaf 3p14 seems to have derived his information only from the orations and the epistles of Julian. The discourse, which is addressed to the Athenians, contains an accurate, though general, account of the war against the Germans. As soon as the valor and conduct of Julian had secured an interval of peace, he applied himself to a work more congenial to his humane and philosophic temper. The cities of Gaul, which had suffered from the inroads of the barbarians, he diligently repaired, and 7 important posts between Mentz and the mouth of the Rhine are particularly mentioned as having been rebuilt and fortified by the order of Julian. 86. The vanquished Germans had submitted to the just but humiliating condition of preparing and conveying the necessary materials. The active zeal of Julian urged the prosecution of the work, and such was the spirit which he had diffused among the troops, that the auxiliaries themselves, waiving their exemption from any duties of fatigue, contended in the most servile labors with the diligence of the Roman soldiers. It was incumbent on the Caesar to provide for the subsistence, as well as for the safety, of the inhabitants and of the garrisons. The desertion of the former and the mutiny of the latter must have been the fatal and inevitable consequences of famine. The tillage of the provinces of Gaul had been interrupted by the calamities of war, but the scanty harvests of the continent were supplied, by his paternal care, from the plenty of the adjacent island. 600 large barks framed in the forest of the Ardennes made several voyages to the coast of Britain, and returning from thence laden with corn, sailed up the Rhine and distributed their cargoes to the several towns and fortresses along the banks of the river. 87. The arms of Julian had restored a free and secure navigation, which Constantius had offered to purchase at the expense of his dignity and of a tributary present of 2,000 pounds of silver. The emperor parsimoniously refused to his soldiers the sums which he granted with a lavish and trembling hand to the barbarians. The dexterity as well as the firmness of Julian was put to a severe trial, when he took the field with a discontented army, which had already served 2 campaigns without receiving any regular pay or any extraordinary donative. 88, 86, Orat, X, P. 2000 Timon 2000 Timon. Of these 7 posts, 4 are at present towns of some consequence: Bingen, Andernach, Bonn, and Neuss. The other 3, Tricesime, Quadribogium, and Castra Herculis, or Heraclea, no longer subsist, but there is room to believe that on the ground of Quadribogium the Dutch have constructed the fort of Schenk, a name so offensive to the fastidious delicacy of Boileau. See D'Anville, Notices de l'Ancien Gaul, p. 1a83. Boileau, Epître If, and the Notes. Note, Tricesime, Kellen, Maner, quoted by Wagner. Heraclea, Ecleus, in the district of Juliers. St. Martin 2, 31-1. M. Return we may credit Julian himself, or hath, ad sp. Q. Atheniansem, p. 2080, who gives a very particular account of the transaction. Zosimus adds 200 vessels more. LL3. p. 45. If we compute the 600 corn ships of Julian at only 70 tons each, they were capable of exporting 120,000 quarters. See Arbuthnot's Weights and Measures, p. 2055, and the country which could bear so large an exportation must already have attained an improved state of agriculture. 88 to return. The troops once broke out into a mutiny immediately before the second passage of the Rhine. Amiens. 17. 9. A tender regard for the peace and happiness of his subjects was the ruling principle which directed, or seemed to direct, the administration of Julian. 89. He devoted the leisure of his winter quarters to the offices of civil government, and affected to assume, with more pleasure, the character of a magistrate than that of a general. Before he took the field, he devolved on the provincial governors most of the public and private causes which had been referred to his tribunal, but on his return, he carefully revised their proceedings, mitigated the rigor of the law, and pronounced a second judgment on the judges themselves. Superior to the last temptation of virtuous minds, an indiscreet and intemperate zeal for justice, he restrained with calmness and dignity the warmth of an advocate who prosecuted for extortion the president of the Narbonnese province. "Who will ever be found guilty," exclaimed the vehement Delphidius, "if it be enough to deny?" "And who," replied Julian, "will ever be innocent if it be sufficient to affirm?" In the general administration of peace and war, the interest of the sovereign is commonly the same as that of his people. But Constantius would have thought himself deeply injured if the virtues of Julian had defrauded him of any part of the tribute which he extorted from an oppressed and exhausted country. The prince who was invested with the ensigns of royalty might sometimes presume to correct the rapacious insolence of his inferior agents, to expose their corrupt arts, and to introduce an equal and easier mode of collection. But the management of the finances was more safely entrusted to Florentius, Praetorian prefect of Gaul, an effeminate tyrant, incapable of pity or remorse, and the haughty minister complained of the most decent and gentle opposition, while Julian himself was rather inclined to censure the weakness of his own behavior. The Caesar had rejected, with abhorrence, a mandate for the levy of an extraordinary tax, a new superindiction, which the prefect had offered for his signature, and the faithful picture of the public misery, by which he had been obliged to justify his refusal, offended the court of Constantius. We may enjoy the pleasure of reading the sentiments of Julian, as he expresses them with warmth and freedom in a letter to one of his most intimate friends. After stating his own conduct, he proceeds in the following terms. Was it possible for the disciple of Plato and Aristotle to act otherwise than I have done? Could I abandon the unhappy subjects entrusted to my care? Was I not called upon to defend them from the repeated injuries of these unfeeling robbers? A tribune who deserts his post is punished with death and deprived of the honors of burial. With what justice could I pronounce his sentence if, in the hour of danger, I myself neglected a duty far more sacred and far more important? God has placed me in this elevated post. His providence will guard and support me. Should I be condemned to suffer, I shall derive comfort from the testimony of a pure and upright conscience. Would to heaven that I still possessed a counselor like Sallust. If they think proper to send me a successor, I shall submit without reluctance, and had much rather improve the short opportunity of doing good than enjoy a long and lasting impunity of evil. 90. The precarious and dependent situation of Julian displayed his virtues and concealed his defects. The young hero who supported, in Gaul, the throne of Constantius was not permitted to reform the vices of the government, but he had courage to alleviate or to pity the distress of the people. Unless he had been able to revive the martial spirit of the Romans, or to introduce the arts of industry and refinement among their savage enemies, he could not entertain any rational hopes of securing the public tranquility, either by the peace or conquest of Germany. Yet the victories of Julian suspended, for a short time, the inroads of the barbarians, and delayed the ruin of the Western Empire. 90. The Seven. Julian. Epistole. 15. Edit. Spanheim. Such a conduct almost justifies the encomium of Mamertinus. Ita illi annis spatia divisa sunt, ut aut barbaros domitet, aut sibibus jura restituat, perpetuum professus, aut contra hostem, aut contra vitia, certamen. His salutary influence restored the cities of Gaul, which had been so long exposed to the evils of civil discord, barbarian war, and domestic tyranny, and the spirit of industry was revived with the hopes of enjoyment. Agriculture, manufactures, and commerce again flourished under the protection of the laws, and the curiae, or civil corporations, were again filled with useful and respectable members. The youth were no longer apprehensive of marriage, and married persons were no longer apprehensive of posterity. The public and private festivals were celebrated with customary pomp, and the frequent and secure intercourse of the provinces displayed the image of national prosperity. 91. A mind like that of Julian must have felt the general happiness of which he was the author, but he viewed with particular satisfaction and complacency the city of Paris, the seat of his winter residence, and the object even of his partial affection. 92. That splendid capital, which now embraces an ample territory on either side of the Seine, was originally confined to the small island in the midst of the river, from whence the inhabitants derived a supply of pure and salubrious water. The river bathed the foot of the walls, and the town was accessible only by 2 wooden bridges. A forest overspread the northern side of the Seine, but on the south the ground, which now bears the name of the university, was insensibly covered with houses, and adorned with a palace and amphitheatre, baths, an aqueduct, and a field of Mars for the exercise of the Roman troops. The severity of the climate was tempered by the neighborhood of the ocean, and with some precautions which experience had taught, the vine and fig tree were successfully cultivated. But in remarkable winters the Seine was deeply frozen, and the huge pieces of ice that floated down the stream might be compared by an Asiatic to the blocks of white marble which were extracted from the quarries of Phrygia. The licentiousness and corruption of Antioch recalled to the memory of Julian the severe and simple manners of his beloved Lutetia. 93. Where the amusements of the theatre were unknown or despised. He indignantly contrasted the effeminate Syrians with the brave and honest simplicity of the Gauls, and almost forgave the intemperance, which was the only stain of the Celtic character. 94. If Julian could now revisit the capital of France, he might converse with men of science and genius, capable of understanding and of instructing a disciple of the Greeks. He might excuse the lively and graceful follies of a nation whose martial spirit has never been enervated by the indulgence of luxury, and he must applaud the perfection of that inestimable art which softens and refines and embellishes the intercourse of social life. 92. Return. See Julian. In Misopogon, p. 340-341. The primitive state of Paris is illustrated by Henry Valesius, Yad Amian, XX24 Tyrian Valesius or de Valois, and M. Danville, in their respective Noticias of Ancient Gaul, the Abbé de Longuerhue, de Description de la France, tom. Ya p. 1213 and M. Bonamy, Gamina, Yakoue, in Misopogon, b. Chelfar. Lustia, or Lutetia, was the ancient name of the city, which, according to the fashion of the 4th century, assumed the territorial appellation of Parisiae.